paid her to clean, nothing more. No questions, no connection. For 2 years, she moved through his home like part of the architecture, quiet, precise, invisible. Until one day, curiosity got the better of him. He followed her. 20 minutes later, he stood in the shadows, frozen. What he saw wasn't betrayal, it wasn't crime. It was something deeper, and it changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. This story might stay with you longer than you expect. Jonathan Crane lived in a mansion perched on Beacon Hill, a place where wealth lived quietly behind glass and stone. The house was spotless, the gardens flawless, and yet, inside, it felt lifeless. After losing his wife to cancer, Jonathan stopped living. The mansion became his cage, empty rooms, silent halls, no guests, no music, no joy, just board meetings, reports, and routines. Except for one thing. Every morning at exactly 7 Sagar, Grace arrived. No doorbell, no delays, just the sound of the gate recognizing her approach. She entered through the side entrance and disappeared into the rhythm of work, gloves on, hair tied, not a single wasted step. She never complained, never sighed. She moved like someone carrying purpose rather than burden. At first, he barely noticed, but slowly, Jonathan found himself watching. First out of habit, then out of need. She wasn't just efficient. She was composed, dignified, strong in a way that didn't scream but whispered. And then he noticed the small things. Her shoes, worn, her bag, frayed. He offered her more money. She declined. Fewer workdays? She politely refused. No matter what he said, her answers stayed the same, polite, firm, distant. One morning, as she placed his breakfast on the table with her usual quiet grace, he tried again. "This table's a bit big for one person," he said. "You're welcome to join me." She paused, just for a moment. "Thank you, sir," she replied gently, "but I need to finish cleaning the study before 9. Then she left. He stared at his untouched food, feeling something unfamiliar stir inside. Not because she disrespected him, but because, for the first time in years, someone had told him no, not cruelly, not boldly, just gracefully. And he realized the only person truly alive in that house had never been him. That afternoon, Jonathan sat in front of his glowing screen, pretending to work. Reports flickered, numbers shifted, but his mind had already wandered. Outside, through the tall windows, he saw her again. Grace was walking through the courtyard, carrying a bucket and a cloth bundle. She moved the way she always did, calm, steady, composed. But this time, he noticed something different. She paused near the stairs, just for a second. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders dipped slightly under the weight before she straightened again, as if nothing had happened. Later, he passed her in the hallway. She was organizing books, reaching for the top shelf, but her arms strained, her fingers trembled. He stopped. "Everything all right?" he asked. She looked down quickly. "Just a little dizzy. I'll be fine." But her voice lacked its usual strength. Her skin looked paler, and now he could see the shadows under her eyes. At lunch, she served his food like always, perfect, professional, but barely touched her own. A small plate, barely a meal. She just moved it around. When he offered her his untouched salmon, she smiled politely. "There's plenty at home. Thank you." Another lie. He was starting to recognize them. Late that afternoon, as she made coffee, he noticed something else. She quietly took a vial from her bag and, looking around, quickly swallowed 2 pills. The label was from a private clinic known for expensive medication. She returned the vial to her bag with a carefulness that looked more like guilt than routine. When he stepped into the kitchen, her face was unreadable again. "More coffee, Mr. Crane?" she asked smoothly. He nodded, watching her. "Feeling okay?" "Just a headache," she replied, too easily. But he knew now. It wasn't just tiredness. It wasn't just work. Something deeper was happening, and she was hiding it. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked the long hallways, recalling every glance, every deflection, every quiet lie. Grace's silence wasn't empty. It was guarded. At exactly 7 a.m., he waited on the veranda. She arrived on time, as always, but now every movement meant more. Her steps were slower. She leaned slightly to the left, like she was favoring one leg. She clutched her bag tighter. During breakfast, he tried a different approach. "Do you live far?" he asked. "Not too far." "Any family nearby?" A pause, a flicker behind her eyes. "I have children." Children. After 2 years, that was the first personal detail she'd ever shared. Her voice cracked slightly as she said it. Her hands trembled, clearing the dishes. He realized now, the exhaustion wasn't from labor. The lies weren't meant to deceive. They were her defense. That afternoon, she collapsed. It happened in seconds. A stumble, a hand on the wall, and then she fell beside the vacuum. The sound echoed through the empty house. Jonathan ran to her. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold and damp. He lifted her gently onto the couch and reached for his phone, heart racing. But when she opened her eyes, she whispered hoarsely, "Don't call the hospital. You fainted. You need—" "Please," she said, louder now, desperation in her voice. Panic, not pain. She wasn't afraid of being sick. She was afraid of being seen. He didn't make the call. He gave her water, let her rest, sat silently as she slept. An hour later, she insisted on going home. So he followed. 15 minutes after she left on foot, Jonathan Crane got into his car and started driving. Not as her employer, but as a man who'd finally decided to care. The sky was heavy, the city lights distant and flickering. And Grace, just ahead, walked with determination, but her limp gave her away. He had no idea where she was going, but he knew this much. He was done pretending everything was fine. Her steps carried her away from Beacon Hill, not toward any home Jonathan recognized. The streets grew unfamiliar. The red brick elegance of the city gave way to crumbling facades and fading storefronts. It wasn't a part of Boston Jonathan Crane had ever walked through, only seen on permits and zoning maps. Still, he followed. Grace turned onto a dimly lit block. The flickering neon sign above the corner read only, "Mary and Sati," the rest long burned out. She vanished behind a crooked door, into a building wedged between an abandoned store and a run-down check-cashing spot. No sign, no light. But she entered like someone returning to the only place that still felt like home. Jonathan parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot. The closer he got, the worse the building looked. Bent fire escape, water-stained walls, a front door that didn't quite fit its frame, and yet she had walked inside without hesitation. From the alley, he spotted a high, dusty window and peered in. What he saw stopped him cold. Inside, the space was dim and crowded. There were no offices, no systems, just rows of cots, worn blankets, old chairs. Dozens of women sat huddled on the floor, rocking babies, sharing simple meals in plastic containers. Children, too, one curled up on a coat near a radiator, a few coloring at a battered table with broken crayons. And Grace wasn't cleaning. She was smiling. Hair down, jacket off, she moved between people like one of them, offering comfort, serving food, listening, kneeling beside a toddler, gently wiping his nose, helping an older woman with a shaking hand open a can of soup. Grace, silent, private, composed, Grace, looked more alive in that moment than Jonathan had ever seen her. This wasn't a job. This was survival, a shelter with no name, a sanctuary for the forgotten, held together not by policy, but by care. He stayed there an hour, hidden, watching. He saw her mop the floors, stitch a rip in a child's jacket, carry crates of food, organize supplies by expiration dates. She worked with quiet purpose, no fatigue, no hesitation, as if this space gave her more strength than it took. Then, close to 9, she opened her black bag in the far corner. Jonathan moved closer, careful not to be seen. From it, she took the same vial of pills, but this time there was more. A thick medical folder, a name written in rushed handwriting across the front, a child's name. She flipped through it, stopping on what looked like an X-ray or scan. Her shoulders tensed, and when she looked up, the light in her eyes had changed. It wasn't exhaustion, it was sorrow, worn like a second skin. Jonathan stepped back, breath caught in his chest. The folder said what she wouldn't. A sick child, maybe her own. He didn't go home that night. Instead, he sat in a 24-hour diner, staring into a cup of coffee that went cold in his hand. His mind spiraled through everything he'd ignored. Her tired eyes, her tight-lipped refusals, the shoes she never replaced, the meals she didn't eat. It wasn't pride, it was protection. And now he saw it clearly. She was fighting a battle alone, holding up not just herself, but someone else's world too. He thought of Rebecca, of all the things he couldn't save her from, even with the best care, the best money, the best intentions. It hadn't been enough. And Grace? She was doing everything with none of those things. He returned home just before dawn. The mansion looked different now. Not larger, not grander, just emptier, like a shell of something that used to matter. Art he didn't like, rugs he never cared for, and that piano, still untouched. Something cracked open inside him. At 6:55 the next morning, he was already in the study, watching the gate, waiting. And there she was. Grace, her jacket zipped high, her stride stiffer than usual, entered the kitchen like every day. But this time, when she turned, she saw him already seated at the table, waiting, and nothing would ever be the same again. She walked in like every morning, fully dressed, bag over her shoulder, coffee untouched. "Good morning, Mr. Crane," she said, and set her things down. "Morning, Grace," he replied, but that day, Jonathan didn't work. He just watched, from room to room, noting every detail, the way she steadied herself when she thought no one was looking, how she paused at the base of the stairs, how she smiled without light behind it. When he offered her lunch, she declined. When he asked if she felt better, she answered with a practiced calm, but her body said otherwise. That afternoon, she left again, and Jonathan followed. But this time, she didn't go to the shelter. Instead, she boarded a city bus. He trailed behind in his car, anxiety flickering under his skin. 20 minutes later, in a part of town even more neglected than before, she stepped off. He parked, waited, then followed her on foot. She entered a building marked St. Agnes Free Clinic, part church, part medical facility. He waited outside for a moment, then slipped quietly into the lobby. Inside, he found her through a small window labeled Pediatrics. She stood beside a little girl, no older than 7. Her head was wrapped in a scarf, her hoodie bright pink but faded. Her hand gripped Grace's tightly, clinging with quiet urgency. Jonathan sat in the corner, trying to blend in. He watched as Grace spoke to the receptionist, calm but insistent. The child leaned against her side, lips barely moving, her eyes too tired for someone so young. When they left, he didn't follow. He remained seated, staring at the door they'd just passed through. The mystery was over. In its place stood the truth, simple and devastating. The fatigue, the pills, the silence. Grace Silva wasn't just hiding pain. She was carrying the weight of a daughter's illness, and she was doing it completely alone. Jonathan stood slowly and left. He drove home in silence. The car, the traffic, the world, it all blurred. And by the time he pulled into his driveway, only one thought remained. He couldn't let that little girl die. And Grace? She would never ask for help, so he would give it in a way she could accept, with dignity, quietly, respectfully, even if it meant undoing everything he thought he knew about control and pride. The next morning, Jonathan woke early, not to an alarm, but to a need he couldn't ignore. He sat in the dark study, watching the first light creep across his desk like a silent challenge. And for the first time in years, he realized how much he had missed, how deeply he had buried his empathy under grief. Rebecca's illness had made him feel powerless, but now, with Grace, there was still time to do something that mattered. He poured a cup of coffee he wouldn't drink, and he began making calls. By noon, a quiet wire transfer reached the local food bank, flagged specifically for the shelter Grace visited. He wasn't even sure it had a name, but they knew the address. And more importantly, they knew her. Another donation followed, this time to the pediatric wing at St. Agnes, arranged through a blind fund, no names, no attention, only action. Soon, new medication shipments were scheduled. A heating contractor was dispatched to the shelter, then new mattresses, then a retired nurse, volunteering twice a week, under the banner of community outreach. If Grace noticed anything, she said nothing. She came to work like always, bag on her shoulder, hair pulled back, jacket zipped high. But Jonathan watched her differently now. He saw the way she braced herself when no one was looking, how she skipped meals, how she hesitated at the stairs, just long enough for someone who cared to notice. And this time, he did, but he never said a word. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, using the only tools he trusted: structure, resources, and quiet resolve. He wasn't trying to rescue her. He was trying to make sure she didn't have to keep fighting alone. One evening, Jonathan stood by the window and watched her leave. Her steps looked lighter, just a little. Her bag didn't sag as much on her shoulder, a small thing. But it sparked something unfamiliar inside him. Hope. Still, not everything was getting better. That Thursday, he found her in the kitchen, pale, trembling, slumped against the counter like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Her gloves were off. Her hands gripped the marble, knuckles white. He didn't say a word at first, just stepped forward and quietly poured her a glass of water. She drank it slowly, eyes downcast. "I didn't eat much today," she murmured. "It's nothing." He didn't challenge her, not this time. He simply nodded and asked her to sit down. She hesitated, then did. He offered food. She refused. He offered to call someone. She declined. The same pattern, the same protective distance. But that night, after she left, Jonathan didn't go back to his routine. He drove straight to Marion Street. It was after 9 p.m. The street was quiet. The shelter, once forgotten and cold, now had a faint glow to it. The new furnace had been installed that morning. He hadn't expected her to be there. He had hoped she would rest. But through the window, he saw her, kneeling beside a cot, adjusting an older woman's pillow. Her own exhaustion showed in the lines of her back, in the heaviness of her limbs. But still, she gave. Jonathan didn't knock. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he circled the block, parked out of sight, and sat in silence. For nearly an hour, he wrestled with everything he now knew, the weight of her choices, the quiet power of her endurance, and the ugly truth: the world demanded too much from women like her, then offered them nothing in return. And if he gave her help, money, comfort, rest, she would likely refuse, because accepting might feel like failure, because her pride, though frayed, was all she had left that no one could take. It was the following Monday when he asked her, softly, about her past. They were in the dining room. She had just cleared his plate. The silence between them felt charged now, full of truths too long held back. "Have you always lived in Boston?" he asked, not meeting her eyes. She hesitated. "No, I moved here 7 years ago. Before that, she turned to the sink. Another state, another life. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. But the next morning, something changed. On the kitchen table lay a worn paperback. Not hers, probably, but placed there deliberately. Hope for the broken places. On the first page, a handwritten inscription, "For the ones who keep standing when no one sees them fall." He flipped through it slowly. Stories of recovery, of injustice, of systems failing the people they were meant to protect. And in the acknowledgments, her name. Grace Silva, field contributor. She had written one of the chapters, a quiet, piercing essay about what happens when poverty is mistaken for neglect, about children taken from mothers not because they were unloved, but because their mothers were too poor to prove they cared. She wrote of shelters closing their doors, of workers dismissed for speaking out. She wrote of a girl. And reading it, Jonathan felt something tighten in his chest. Later that day, while she scrubbed the stairs, he sat beside her with 2 coffees. She looked startled, but didn't stop working. "You used to be a social worker," he said. "Yes," she replied softly. "Until I wasn't." "What happened?" She paused, then spoke. "There was a girl, 7 years old. Her mother worked 3 jobs, left her home alone sometimes, not out of neglect, out of survival. Someone reported her. They took the girl. I fought it," Grace said, eyes fixed on the steps. "Said we should support the mother, not punish her. I went public. The agency said I made them look weak. They fired me." "And the girl?" he asked quietly. Grace looked up, and he saw it. That question still hurt. "She was adopted. I never saw her again." He said nothing for a long time. "I'm sorry," he finally said, "that the system failed both of you." She wiped her hands on her apron. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about what you do after they break you." Jonathan thought about that for days. And when a fire inspector came snooping around the shelter, Jonathan made the violation disappear. When the clinic couldn't approve a new MRI for a child, a quiet donation fixed that. Always anonymously, always carefully. Then one afternoon, Grace noticed something small. New cleaning supplies in the kitchen, expensive, eco-safe, clearly not from the usual stockpile. She stared at them for a while before turning to him. "These weren't here before." "I had them delivered," he said evenly. "Why?" "Because the ones we had were running out, and you shouldn't be paying for them out of your own pocket." She folded her arms, her guard rising again. But this time, he didn't flinch, because now he understood. She wasn't looking for pity, just dignity, and that, finally, was something he could offer her. Her mouth tightened. "You notice that?" "I notice more than I used to," Jonathan replied. She said nothing. But the new supplies sat untouched for 2 days, and he didn't press. He waited. Eventually, she used them. The fragile balance between them held, just barely, but he knew it couldn't last. Because the truth neither of them dared speak out loud was growing louder by the day. Grace didn't just need help, she needed real help. And no stack of groceries, no quiet donation, no discreet clinic delivery was going to be enough. Her daughter's life was hanging by a thread, and Grace was clinging to it with nothing but willpower and a fading sense of control. He had to find a way through, but it couldn't be through pity or a check or the cold logic of assistance. It had to be something else, something that wouldn't feel like saving her, but like standing beside her, because the line Grace was walking between duty and collapse was growing thinner by the hour. Winter hit Boston suddenly. The air turned sharp. The wind carved its way through coats and walls in silence. Jonathan watched the season change from the warmth of his study, fireplace crackling, reports unread. Grace still came every morning, Same calm steps, same quiet rhythm, but now he noticed more. Her skin looked grayer, her posture a little lower. She moved slower after crouching, bracing on the countertop before rising. Something had shifted in him. Something irreversible. He could no longer pretend she was just an employee. Grace wasn't a cleaner. She was a mother, a woman trying to keep her child alive while falling apart in silence. And she wouldn't let him help. He tried everything. Quietly, respectfully, new supplies, community partnerships, donated goods routed through anonymous channels, medical transportation arranged through third parties. Even the clinic's extended hours came from his influence, discreetly placed. She never said a word, never asked, never thanked, but she had to know. Food lasted longer, the shelter was warmer, the clinic better stocked. The pattern had changed, and yet, every time he tried to make her life easier, she shut him out. No to bonuses, no to raises, no to time off, just the same gentle barrier. Thank you, but I have what I need. It was a lie, and it hurt more than anything else. Not her silence, not even the child's illness, but that quiet, beautiful lie. A lie that said, I can carry this. That's when he realized, help for her couldn't look like charity. To Grace, dignity wasn't decorative, it was structural. It held her together, so he changed tactics. That Friday, he found her in the pantry, taking inventory, sleeves rolled, clipboard in hand. He approached with quiet resolve, coffee in one hand, documents in the other. Grace, he said, clearing his throat, I've been thinking about expanding my foundation's work, supporting working families. I'd like you to join in a formal capacity. She frowned. As what? Director of Domestic Outreach, salary increase, full benefits, health coverage, flexible scheduling. You'd oversee partnerships, develop programs. I'm a housekeeper, Mr. Crane. You're more than that. She set the clipboard down, folding her arms. I'm not qualified. You ran a shelter, wrote essays, managed entire networks. You're overqualified. She shook her head. Thank you, but no. He stared at her. The frustration wasn't anger. It was heartbreak. Why not? She turned and began sorting cans. Not avoiding, just armoring. I appreciate the offer, she said at last, but I need to stay where I am. I need this job. I can manage the hours. The pay is enough. He wanted to shout, not because she rejected him, but because she was still carrying this alone. Grace, your daughter. Her head snapped around. Her voice dropped low and cold. You don't get to talk about my daughter. Jonathan froze. I'm trying to help, he said softly. I didn't ask. Silence filled the space between them, brittle, bitter, and impossible to cross. She picked up the clipboard again. Please, she said, don't offer things you can't understand. He left the room, not because he wanted to, but because he saw no other choice. The more he reached, the more she pulled away. But her rejection wasn't pride. It was protection, survival. That evening, she left work early, said she had an appointment. He didn't follow her. Instead, he drove back to the shelter. Most of the women were already settling in for the night. Quiet murmurs, blankets shifting, the day winding down. He found one of the older residents, Maya, a former nurse with kind eyes and a voice like warm linen. He asked about Grace. Maya looked around, then lowered her voice. She sleeps in the basement, she said, and paused. On? She sleeps on a mat, Maya said quietly, near the boiler. Won't take a bed unless we have extras. Her voice was gentle, but the words cut deep. She's here every night. Works all day for you, then all night for us. Eats maybe one real meal in between. She thinks we don't notice. Jonathan said nothing. He couldn't. She keeps us together, Maya added. When the roof leaked, she found someone to fix it. When the kids get sick, she runs to the clinic. When food runs low, she eats last, always last. Jonathan blinked up at the ceiling, struggling to steady himself. She's dying on her feet, Maya whispered, but she won't stop, not unless something forces her to. That night, Jonathan made a decision. If Grace wouldn't accept help for herself, then he would help the place she poured her life into. But not with temporary fixes, with something permanent, structured, lasting. He spent the weekend building plans. By Monday, he waited for her in the kitchen with a folder in hand. When she arrived, he handed it to her without ceremony. She opened it slowly, brows furrowing. "What is this?" "A proposal," he said. "I bought the lot next to the clinic. I'm turning it into a full-service resource center. Housing, job training, childcare, legal support, fully staffed, fully funded. I want you to run it." She stared at the papers. "There's a sustainability model," he added. "Grants, endowments, partner organizations are already on board. It could open in 6 months." Still, she said nothing. "I'm not asking you to take this for yourself," he continued gently. "I'm asking you to do it for them, the women you fight for, the kids sleeping on concrete, for your daughter." Her fingers trembled. "Why me?" "Because no one else knows what they need like you do." She closed the folder. "I can't." "Why not?" "I don't want to owe you." "You don't." "I will." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't pity, Grace. This is partnership." She looked up at him, eyes wet, jaw clenched. "You still don't get it. If I let someone else carry this, even for a moment, I might fall, and I might not get back up." He nodded slowly. "Then let me stand beside you, not in front, not above, just beside." She turned away, hands flat on the counter. Neither of them moved for a long time. Finally, she whispered, "Let me think." He nodded. She left early that day, and for the first time, he didn't follow. He waited. The next morning, she walked in with the same worn bag, the same coat, the same quiet, but in her eyes, something had shifted. A question, a possibility. They didn't speak of it, not yet. But he saw the folder sticking from her bag as she worked, and that was enough. The wall between them remained, but now it had a crack. Winter deepened its grip on the city. Black ice cloaked the streets. The wind burned through gloves and brick alike. Every breath hung in the air like a warning. Inside Jonathan's home, the heat remained steady. Floors warm, lights soft, everything in its perfect place, and yet it had never felt colder. Grace moved through the rooms as always, precise, silent, but now she wore gloves inside. Thinner than she needed. Her lips were chapped, her cheeks wind-burnt. Her coat couldn't hold out the cold anymore. Jonathan noticed everything, but he spoke less. He had learned, sometimes, words built walls when what she needed was quiet space. The folder remained untouched on the shelf for days. She didn't bring it up. Neither did he. But she carried it, always with her, inside her bag, near her elbow, within reach. Not opened, not forgotten. It had become a symbol. His offer, her silence, his desire to help, her fear of needing it. She wasn't waiting for more details. She was waiting for something to shift inside herself, something deeper than fear, stronger than pride. He couldn't force it. He could only wait and hope the moment would come before it was too late. It did. 2 days before Christmas. The morning began quietly. Snow had fallen overnight, layering the sidewalks in a soft hush. Jonathan rose early, brewed his coffee, opened the paper but didn't read. Grace arrived right on time, her cheeks red from cold, her breath quick and visible. She nodded her greeting, removed her coat, and began her work. By mid-morning, He noticed her hand trembling in the laundry room. She folded towels slowly, lips pressed thin. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Just tired. I'm fine." But she wasn't. By noon, she moved slower, gripped the stair railing longer, braced herself after every crouch. At 2:15, she almost dropped a tray of dishes. Jonathan caught it just in time. His hand brushed hers. Her fingers were ice. "I think you need to sit down," he said, more firmly this time. "I'm okay," she whispered, even as her knees faltered beneath her. He didn't respond. He just watched her walk out of the room, her steps unsteady. At 4:20 in the afternoon, it all gave out. Grace was walking from the front hallway to the study, carrying a box of holiday decorations, and then, without warning, she collapsed. There was no grace to it, no quiet restraint. Her legs buckled mid-step. Her shoulder slammed against the doorframe. The box crashed to the floor, shattering ornaments and scattering fragments across the hardwood. Jonathan was there in seconds. He dropped to his knees, hands shaking, heart racing. She was half-conscious, her breathing shallow, her skin pale and clammy. "Grace," he said, his voice cracking, "stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. Her lips moved. "Don't call hospital. You need help. No hospitals, please." Her hand gripped his wrist tighter than he thought possible, not just from fear of illness, but from something deeper, something unspoken. He didn't argue. He lifted her carefully, carried her to the living room, and laid her on the sofa, covered her with a blanket, placed a pillow beneath her head, then sat beside her on the floor, terrified and helpless. For the next 20 minutes, she drifted in and out, fever climbing, her body trembling. Finally, just after 5, her voice returned, barely a whisper, but clear. "I didn't sleep." He stared at her. "Grace, when was the last time you slept? A full night?" She didn't answer. "And your daughter?" "She's okay," she whispered. "Last week. Good response. Not remission." Jonathan stood, turning away for a moment, rubbing his face with both hands. The ache in his chest was unbearable now. "You can't do this alone. I have to." "No," he said, facing her again. "You don't. Not anymore." She closed her eyes. "I can't afford to believe that." He knelt back down beside her, voice lower, steadier. "Then let me believe it for you. Until you can." Outside, snow was falling heavier now, burying the streets in silence. A distant siren faded into the distance. Grace pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I didn't want you to see me like this," she murmured. "I didn't want to need you." "I know," he said gently. "But I do," she admitted, almost inaudibly. He didn't respond with words. He simply reached for her hand, held it quietly. She didn't pull away. That night, she didn't go to the shelter. She was too weak to argue, and maybe, for once, too tired to resist. Jonathan didn't call an ambulance. Instead, he contacted a nurse friend from the clinic. She came quietly. No sirens, no uniforms, just calm, competent help, fluids, a medical check, antibiotics, instructions. Grace slept. For the first time in weeks, deeply. Jonathan stayed by her side the entire night. When she woke before dawn, the soft light slipping through the curtains, he was already there, seated nearby, reading the book she had once left for him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "Don't be. I should have told you." "I think you did," he replied, "in your own way." She nodded faintly. Then, without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out the folder, the one she'd carried with her for weeks. She placed it on his lap. "I'll do it," she said, "but only if we do it together." He didn't smile. He just nodded, slow, steady, like he'd just been handed something sacred. "And I'll need time," she added, "for Sophia, For the others, for myself, as much as you need, he said. They sat there for a long while, not employer and employee, not savior and survivor, just people, equal, real, changed. Something had broken between them, not in a way that destroyed, but in a way that allowed something new to grow. He brought her tea. She stayed for the rest of the day, working a little, resting often. He didn't hover. He didn't explain. He just stayed present. That evening, as she prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "You followed me that night," she said. He met her gaze. "Yes." She nodded. "I thought so." No anger, no gratitude, just truth. And the door she walked through no longer felt like a wall between them. Something else had taken root. Not pride, not pity, but something deeper, stronger, real. The snow melted in March, slowly peeling back the skin of the city. Where silence had reigned, now there was sound. Children laughing, neighbors greeting one another, bright flags strung between old utility poles. The season was changing, and so were they. Grace still came to work, but her hours were different now. Sometimes she arrived late, sometimes she left early, and sometimes she brought Sophia with her. The little girl's scarf was snug beneath her chin as she wandered the long, echoing hallways of a house that still felt more like a museum than a home. Her steps were slow, but steady, each one filled with a quiet kind of purpose. Jonathan had quietly added a low cabinet in the living room. It now held children's books and puzzles, nothing extravagant, just soft touches that said, "You're welcome here." Grace had never asked for that, but after Sophia's first visit, she had glanced at the cabinet and given him a look. Half cautious, half approving, silent, but understood, they no longer avoided the past. Grace spoke freely now, about her time in the system, the cases she couldn't forget, the ones she still grieved. Jonathan, in return, spoke of Rebecca, of the days before his life became quiet, curated, and cold. They didn't speak like people saving or being saved. They spoke like survivors, people who had lost something irreplaceable and kept walking anyway. The center, once a fragile proposal passed back and forth in silence, had become real. Permits were filed, contractors interviewed, community groups looped in. It wasn't theory anymore. It had a schedule, a budget, blueprints on paper. Jonathan handled logistics. Grace remembered names and needs. A legal aid clinic volunteered interns. A nonprofit from Somerville offered workforce training. An anonymous donor, one Grace never questioned, quietly covered the first year of operations. And the building, the one Jonathan had bought, was more than a structure now. Once a half-burned boarding house, long abandoned, it now stood between the clinic and an old church. Its porch, once forgotten, had been used by children as a play area. Someone had spray-painted a sun on the front door, faded, but still shining. Construction began in April. Grace stood beside Jonathan as the crews arrived. Her arms were crossed, her expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked. Her eyes didn't leave the old bricks. "I used to think I'd never build anything that lasted," she said. "Everything I touched either fell apart or was taken." He looked at her, steady. "This will last." She didn't respond, but she didn't walk away. What followed were long days and longer nights. Grace didn't just approve plans. She owned them. She met every contractor, helped design the playroom, the kitchen, the intake rooms, attended every meeting, debated code requirements, fought for accessibility, and when the day ended, she still returned to Marion Street, now stronger, steadier, more sustainable. She ran it with quiet strength, not as a martyr, but as a leader. She asked for things now, and Jonathan, he watched with awe, not love, not yet, but something like reverence. She had changed him. He rose earlier, worked with purpose. He laughed, sometimes, and didn't feel guilty for it. The house, and the woman who'd helped shape it, had begun to shift something in him, heal it. Then, 3 weeks before opening day, she didn't show up. At 10 a.m., he waited. At noon, he called. No answer. At 1, he drove to the clinic. There, in exam room 2, Grace sat beside her daughter, hands clenched in her lap, her eyes red, her body still. Sophia lay on the exam table, breathing shallowly beneath a thin blanket. A nurse stood nearby, silent. "They're transferring her tomorrow," Grace said. Her voice was empty. "To Mass General, full-time care. She's not responding anymore." He stepped closer. "Grace, you don't know that. Maybe—" She looked up, eyes burning. "She's dying." He didn't argue. He didn't offer false hope. He sat beside her and covered her hand with his. "I know. She asked me what the house will look like," she said, voice cracking. "I told her it would have a garden, that we'd plant flowers together." He nodded. "We still can." That night, Grace stayed at the hospital. Sophia curled beside her, sleeping under a cartoon print blanket, a stuffed lion tucked under one arm. Machines blinked quietly. The world stood still. 2 days later, Sophia was stable enough to go home, but not for long. A hospice nurse began visiting 3 times a week. Grace moved into a room at Marion Street with her daughter. Jonathan offered his home. Grace declined, gently. "I want her near other kids," she said. "Even if she can't play, I want her to hear laughter." Jonathan visited often, sometimes with soup, sometimes with books. He never stayed too long, always on the edges, never pushing. Grace let him read to Sophia on quiet days. One afternoon, the little girl looked up at him and asked, "Did you build a house for my mom?" He smiled softly. "Yes, for her, and for you." "Can I live there?" "You'll always have a place there." She closed her eyes, smiling faintly. "Tell her not to make it all gray." He chuckled. "I promise." The house opened in late June. There was no ribbon, no press, just a few families on the porch, sunlight through the windows, and the smell of fresh paint and lavender. Grace stood beside Jonathan, her eyes calm, present. In the back, a small garden bloomed, just like Sophia had imagined. Grace had planted the first seeds herself: sunflowers, lavender, tomatoes. And on a wall near the entrance, a hand-painted sign in careful lettering: "For the ones who keep standing, even when no one sees them fall." The soil still held her fingerprints. Inside, the walls were soft greens and blues. But what filled the rooms wasn't just light from the windows. It was something deeper. Every space whispered, "You belong here," not as a burden, but as someone worth holding space for. That evening, after the last guest had left, Grace sat on the front steps beside Jonathan. The sky melted from amber to indigo. "I didn't think I could do it," she said. "You did." "I didn't think I was allowed to." He looked at her, not the woman who used to think she could only serve others, but the one who had now built something lasting. "You were," he said quietly. "You always were." She didn't respond, but she reached over and took his hand, and in the quiet hum of summer dusk, it felt like something permanent had finally been built. Not just the house, not just the garden, but a beginning, a life they'd both thought they were too broken or too late to claim. By mid-July, the garden behind the center had burst to life. Sunflowers stood tall, tomatoes ripened in warm clusters, lavender carried its scent through the breeze. It became a sanctuary, not formal, but sacred in its own quiet way. Children played between the beds. Women braided hair, shelled peas, or simply sat in the sun without fear. Grace watched it all with quiet knowing, the kind that understands how fragile peace really is. But Sophia wasn't there to see it bloom. She passed 2 weeks before the official opening. In the shelter room she had come to call her castle. There was no funeral in the traditional sense, no procession, no suits, just a gathering in the garden. Sophia's favorite blanket laid on the grass, a box of crayons in the middle of the table. Grace had asked every child who knew her to draw a picture, something bright, something she would have loved. They hung them on a string between the trees. They fluttered like little flags of memory and hope. Jonathan stood behind Grace as she read each one. When she cried, it made no sound. He didn't speak, didn't touch her. He simply stayed. The days after blurred. Grace stopped coming to the mansion, not from anger, not rejection, just necessity. She needed to stay where the wound had opened. She cleaned the shelter by hand, reorganized closets, swept the garden paths at dawn and dusk. The staff offered to take over. She refused. Grief for Grace was work. Jonathan returned to his house and found it cold again, too large, too quiet, too sharp. He tried to focus on numbers, reports, logistics, but his thoughts always circled back to Sophia's last smile, to the way Grace held her daughter's hand like she could will her to stay. A week later, he came back. She was in the garden, pulling weeds by the marigolds. She didn't look up when he approached. He waited. When she finished, she sat back, dirt on her knees, and finally met his eyes. "You're still here," she said. "I wasn't going anywhere." They sat together in the soil, in silence. Finally, she spoke. "I've been keeping the center open in the afternoons, for mothers, the ones who just need a few hours to think." He nodded. "I added a music room too. A few volunteers brought instruments. Sophia always wanted to learn guitar." He couldn't speak, not right away. "I want her name on the building," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Jonathan reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded slip of paper. She looked at him, surprised. "I've had the new sign ready for weeks," he said. "Just waiting for you to ask." She laughed. It came suddenly, raw, and ended in tears. The next morning, they installed the plaque together. Simple, bronze. The Sophia Brooks Community House for the ones we hold and the ones we let go. After that day, everything shifted. Grace stopped splitting herself into fragments. She wasn't just the woman who cleaned or the mother who suffered. She became something whole, present. She spoke to city councils, drafted policy recommendations, gave interviews. Every success was steady, every victory earned. The Grace who once refused help now understood what partnership meant. The Grace who once moved in shadows now stood fully in the light. And Jonathan remained beside her, not as a benefactor, though anonymous donations still arrived, not as a suitor, though something between them had deepened. He stayed simply as a man who had once watched her fall, and chose, from that moment on, never to let her carry the weight alone. They began to have dinner together. No candles, no labels, just food, conversation, presence. Sometimes he brought takeout. Sometimes she reheated soup. They talked, not about Sophia, though her name came up gently now and then, but about music, about stories, about nothing. He told her everything about Rebecca for the first time. She listened, without pity, and never asked for more than he offered. One evening, she led him into the music room. A small child plucked at a ukulele, off-key, delighted. Grace leaned against the wall and watched. "She would have loved this," she whispered. "I know." She turned to him. "I'm glad you followed me," she said. "Back then, I was furious, but if you hadn't, I don't think we'd be here now." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. Outside, the wind stirred the garden. The last petals of summer drifted across the lawn. Later that year, the center held its first winter festival. The children sang off-key in the music room. Volunteers built lopsided snowmen. Even the mayor came, trying to shake every hand. Grace stood at the steps, wrapped in a red scarf, watching. Jonathan stood beside her, their hands brushed, not quite holding, but her fingers curled toward his. And in the cold breath of a new season, what remained between them wasn't only sorrow, it was something else now, something rooted, something tender, something still alive. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Watch our other videos for more powerful stories like this. And if this meant something to you, share it. Someone else might need it.